For many decades, Germany has served as the stabilizing force of Europe, the engine of the EU, its strongest economy, and the manufacturing powerhouse behind roughly 10% of all goods produced worldwide. What seemed like an unstoppable economic model is now beginning to unravel. Today, Germany is expected to see its economy contract for a second consecutive year. Major German firms are finding it harder to remain competitive in global markets. Even Volkswagen, a company deeply woven into Germany's industrial identity, has recently discussed closing factories on German soil, something that has never happened in its 87-year existence. Forecasts now suggest that the country may slip into a third straight year of recession, and more than 3 million Germans have already lost their jobs as the downturn spreads. Rather than accept this slow decline, the German government has decided to make an enormous wager, one worth €500 billion. This unprecedented spending program, equal to roughly 15% of the nation's GDP, marks the biggest financial commitment Germany has made in its modern history. For a country defined by fiscal restraint, balanced budgets, and long-standing reluctance to borrow money, this move represents a dramatic and historic departure from tradition. Germany's refusal to take on excessive debt has been a cornerstone of its economic success. It helped build the nation's reputation as Europe's financial anchor, but crises of this magnitude demand extraordinary responses, and Berlin has concluded that choosing bold action is the only way to prevent further decline. If the gamble succeeds, it could revive not only the German economy, but also inject new energy into Europe as a whole. If it fails, however, Germany risks damaging the credibility it has spent generations building, and it may drag down the entire European economy in the process. How did Germany reach this point, and does this massive gamble stand any chance of working? At first glance, Germany looks similar to many wealthy countries: a well-educated population, a strong social safety net, and a prosperous middle class. Yet, beneath the surface, its economic structure is unusual. Typically, as nations grow richer, they shift from producing physical goods to providing services such as finance, consulting, entertainment, software, and law. Germany remains an outlier. It continues to rely heavily on manufacturing, exporting vast quantities of machinery, vehicles, and industrial equipment, much of it to other European countries. Consider Wolfsburg in northern Germany. It hosts the world's largest automobile factory, where more than 60,000 people are employed, and nearly 1 million vehicles are assembled each year. That single facility produces more cars annually than entire countries like Italy or the United Kingdom. Germany generates more than 1/4 of Europe's manufactured output, and exports account for about half of its GDP, triple the share of the United States, and significantly higher than that of France or the UK. This model worked extraordinarily well when global demand was strong. Germany consistently brought in far more money from exports than it spent on imports. The surplus capital flowed into German companies, enabling them to expand, innovate, and hire more workers. It also boosted tax revenues, giving the government financial flexibility without needing to rely on heavy borrowing. But this model also came with a glaring vulnerability. If global demand declined and foreign buyers stopped purchasing German goods, the entire economic system would be at risk of collapse. Instead of addressing the structural fragility, the German government chose to double down. In 2009, it introduced a constitutional rule known as the debt brake, which essentially prevented the state from borrowing more than 0.35% of GDP per year under normal circumstances. For comparison, the United States routinely borrows more than 10 times that amount annually. The logic behind the debt brake was simple. If Germany could guarantee extremely low levels of borrowing far into the future, investors would view the country as one of the safest places in the world to lend money. That confidence would push interest rates lower, saving billions and reinforcing Germany's financial strength. For a decade, this strategy worked beautifully. Between 2010 and 2019, Germany's economy expanded by nearly a quarter, outperforming much of Europe. Unemployment fell to historic lows, dropping below 5%. The country consistently recorded enormous trade surpluses, over $200 billion every year, more than any other nation on earth. Germany became synonymous with quality, discipline, and reliability, from the efficiency of its trains to the precision of its engineering. It was the backbone of the European project. But a series of unprecedented shocks, beginning in 2020, exposed the fragility of this seemingly invincible system. The first blow came with the global pandemic. Lockdowns around the world brought trade to a sudden stop. For Germany, whose economy depends more than almost any other on selling goods abroad, the impact was devastating. Exports plummeted by roughly 10% within months, wiping out over 100 billion euros in revenue. The auto industry, the crown jewel of German manufacturing, was severely hit, with production falling by nearly a quarter. By the end of 2020, Germany's GDP had contracted by about 5%, marking its worst economic result since World War II. Just as Germany started to recover, another crisis erupted: Russia's invasion of Ukraine. Within days, exports to Russia vanished, a loss of about 20 billion euros. Although this represented only a small share of Germany's overall trade, the real crisis came from energy. Before the war, more than half of Germany's natural gas came from Russia, powering much of its industrial sector. When Russian gas imports collapsed by 90%, energy prices skyrocketed. Electricity costs surged by roughly 35% in just a few months. Factories could not afford to operate, not because customers disappeared, but because energy prices made production impossible. As plants shut down and supply chains faltered, Germany slid deeper into recession. By the end of 2024, the nation had lost more than $200 billion in GDP, enough to fund Germany's entire healthcare system 6 times over. Most advanced economies respond to crises by borrowing heavily to stimulate growth. The United States, for example, spent over $5 trillion during the pandemic. Governments typically increase spending, support businesses, and invest in public projects to revive economic activity. But Germany was trapped by its own debt brake. Even as unemployment soared above 3 million, the government was legally prohibited from borrowing enough to rescue the economy. Factories could not afford to operate, not because customers disappeared, but because energy prices made production impossible. As plants shut down and supply chains faltered, Germany slid deeper into recession. By the end of 2024, the nation had lost more than $200 billion in GDP, enough to fund Germany's entire healthcare system 6 times over. Most advanced economies respond to crises by borrowing heavily to stimulate growth. The United States, for example, spent over $5 trillion during the pandemic. Governments typically increase spending, support businesses, and invest in public projects to revive economic activity. But Germany was trapped by its own debt brake. Even as unemployment soared above 3 million, the government was legally prohibited from borrowing enough to rescue the economy.